going along on the ride with me, and today it's just a walk. It's going to survey some of the land and maybe mark out a downhill trail on this opening section over here. Alright, so on to the course topic for this week, and that is caffeine. Caffeine is one of three chemicals that are in the class of chemicals known as xanthines. It's with an X, xanthines. And we're going to explore three different plants that have these chemicals in them. Coffee, tea, and chocolate. So that's our goal today, is to look at those three plants and examine what's in them, where they come from, how we harnessed their psychoactive powers, if you will, and so forth. Hill now. So let's start with some basic facts. The xanthine group, or caffeine, is a drug that is the most widely psychoactive used substance in the world. It has relatively mild psychoactive effects in terms of change of consciousness, other than having a stimulant effect, making you more aware of what's going on around you. And that's because it's engaging the sympathetic branch of your autonomic nervous system, raising heart rate, dilating blood vessels, and the iris of the eye, allowing you to see more, hear better, move faster. And that's the goal of the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, to get your body up and running. Fight or flight response is related to that. So let's start with coffee. Coffee is a bean, grows on the one of two different types of bushes, Caffeine arabica, which produces a milder, less bitter and acidic coffee, but is harder to grow, so it's generally more expensive. And Caffeine robusta, which is more bitter, but the plant is somewhat easier to grow. Caffeine robusta is more likely to be found in places like Dunkin' Donuts, McDonald's, etc., because of its lower cost and easier growing patterns. All right, so coffee goes back about roughly 1,200 years, I believe, back to the 800 AD period in the country of Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, legend has it, there was a young boy named Chaldee. And Chaldee had a herd of goats. He'd take them to this particular hill and allow them to run around as they will and eat everything as they will. And he noticed that after eating a bean off of a particular plant, the berry produced very active goats. They would be dancing around, he said. They would be extra active. And so experimenting is, of course, how humans understand any plant in terms of its viability as a food source or as a drug or a medicine. And eventually they found that coffee has the same effect on humans. So this is the coffee bean. There's a link to a coffee ceremony there in the notes. You can click on that and go to Ethiopia and enjoy a coffee ceremony with the host of the video. Fresh roasted beans are really quite good, as the video describes. All right, here we are, at the top of the hill. Down trees here. I'm going to build a trail right through these trees, going down the hill fast. and a curvy pattern. So, I wonder if I can do all three of these things at the same time. Let's see. After the process of understanding the effects of the coffee bean on people was perfected, originally they chewed on the raw beans. Doesn't sound very enticing, but they would get a lift off of that, the same way that the ancient Inca would chew on the coca leaves in South America. But then they started boiling the beans, but not long after that, a few hundred years perhaps, but in the scheme of things, a relatively short time, somebody burned the beans, and they decided that that actually produced a nice aroma and a good flavor, and those roasted beans became the mode of preparation, the way in which you make coffee from then on. It helped to reduce the bitterness, burn off some of the acidic tannins, and it also that's what gives coffee its distinctive color, that brown color. It's because it's roasted. It doesn't come from the original beans, which are generally green. All right, so in terms of caffeine, that's the main xanthine chemical. Remember, that's the class of chemicals that gives us that lift. And it's not just caffeine, but that's the most powerful chemical in the class, and that's what you'll find in all three of our foods and drinks we're talking about this class. So in terms of the caffeine in coffee, a small coffee, black, or however you take it, with sugar or milk or cream or whatever flavoring, a small coffee is generally going to run you about 115 milligrams of caffeine. 115 milligrams, well, what's that? That's about 1/4 or 1/4 of the general recommended daily allowance of caffeine, which is somewhere around 450 milligrams per day. So that's 4 small 5-ounce cups of coffee. Very small, 5 ounces isn't that much. You get a big coffee from Starbucks or Jazzy Joe's, and you're talking probably double that, 230. So 2 of those big coffees, that'd be probably good to stop there for the day. Any more than that regularly, day after day, is going to create problems with the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. You could have dependence develop as well on caffeine, because when you remove the caffeine, it's going to have a very harsh effect in terms of withdrawal. You probably get headaches. You might feel fatigued, muscle pains perhaps, and that's because it's affecting our energy systems. Caffeine interacts with adenosine. It blocks adenosine receptors. Adenosine is not one of the 7 neurotransmitters I asked you to learn in the first part of the course, which was represented by the term snagged, if you recall. Serotonin, norepinephrine, acetylcholine is the A, GABA glutamate, endorphins, and dopamine. So snagged. Adenosine is another one of the 100+ neurotransmitters that are known to exist, and it's one that relates to our energies. I won't get into the ATP, but if you've taken anatomy and physiology, or basic biology, you probably know what ATP is. It's part of the energy systems of the mitochondria in the cells of the body, which keeps the body going. It transfers energy to cells. So it's important in that function, but it's also important in terms of inhibiting brain activity, any neural activity, brain and body. And so when you block that inhibiting neurotransmitter, adenosine, you get a stimulating effect, the opposite of effect. If you block inhibition, that's an excitation. So that's what's going on with caffeine when you take it. All right, so neuroscience there. One last thing about coffee. We drink a lot of it, about 25 gallons per person in the United States every year is the quantity of coffee we generally drink. And some people make up for those of us, like myself, who don't drink any coffee. I never acquired the taste. I don't like the taste of coffee, so I don't drink it. But what I do drink is tea. drinking about 9 times the amount of coffee that Americans drink are the English, of course. The English are the tea snobs of the world. That begins in the 1500s when we've got global trade just beginning with new shipping technology available and new explorers roaming the world. Some of those explorers found China, and in China, of course, that's where the tea bush grows. The tea bush, Camellia sinensis is the scientific name for tea, is a particular bush, a particular plant, one particular plant, Camellia sinensis, and from that we get all the varieties of tea: white tea, green tea, black tea. What we don't get from that is herbal tea. Herbal tea is a mock tea, if you will. It's not actual tea, unless it's mixed. That would be a flavored tea then, like Earl Grey, a classic tea that mixes Camellia sinensis tea leaves with an herb called bergamot. Tea is less caffeinated per drink, but per pound, tea actually has more caffeine in it. However, it takes a lot more tea leaves than coffee beans to produce one beverage. So by virtue of that, you get more caffeine in coffee than you do in tea as you're drinking it. That amount would be roughly 45 to 60 milligrams of caffeine in your basic tea. Now, I mentioned tea comes in different varieties. Tea can be white, green, or black. And the difference is not in the actual leaves themselves of the plant, but rather in how long you leave the leaves out to oxidize, how long they're exposed to oxygen before they're packaged up and removed from the general air. Oxidation is what turns the leaves black. So the longer you leave them out, the more likely you're going to have black leaves. Look at this deer fur here. Yeah. Wild place. Looks like a deer trail too. It's a nice trail to follow with the bike. So we've got those 3 different varieties of tea, depending on how long you leave the leaves to oxidate. And of course, there are different ways of preparing the tea. Very popular in the United States is iced tea. 75% of the tea drunk is in the form of iced tea, particularly after the popularity of Arizona and Lipton teas came out in the supermarket and convenience stores. What else about tea? Tea has caffeine in it, but it also has a second xanthine chemical that affects your nervous system, and that chemical is theophylline. Theophylline is a xanthine that doesn't produce as much stimulant effect as caffeine, but in higher doses can help asthma because it does have a stimulant effect, particularly in the bronchial tubes of the lungs, and that can open up the lungs and allow people to breathe better who have asthma. Culturally, tea is responsible for the emergence of the very first multinational corporation, and that's a business called the East India Trading Company. There's an English East India Trading Company, a Dutch East India Trading Company, and they're related to the importation of products from East India, initially tea, and then other products. We'll come back to talking about them when we discover opium and its source of importation. And so these corporations, truly multinational in scope, were really the opening of the era of global capitalism, which by today has entirely immersed the world with its wealth of benefits in terms of products that we can get at any time from Amazon.com, for instance, and some of the downsides to globalization, which include immense wealth inequality and other factors. So we won't get into that right now. Let's get back to tea. Tea was inspirational culturally, of course, in the American Revolution and the taxation of tea, as well as the Stamp Act, were further reasons to rebel and revolt against the English crown. To drink tea was to be seen as loyal to the crown, as truly English. And so that's when Americans started to drink more and more coffee instead of tea, and have always, throughout our history, drunk more coffee than tea. Okay, so chocolate. Chocolate is the food that also has some caffeine in it, but not much at all. Whereas a decaffeinated cup of coffee with the caffeine stripped out of it, let me do a little aside here. How is the caffeine taken out of coffee? After all, I always assumed it was some kind of laboratory process, but essentially it's soaked out. You just use an organic solvent. I'm not sure what solvent is used specifically, but probably one that doesn't taint the flavor of the coffee bean. And it strips out chemicals in the bean like caffeine. So the xanthines are removed. Most of them are. It leaves about 3 milligrams of caffeine in a cup of coffee. So that's compared to 115 in a caffeinated cup. So it removes almost all of it, all but like 1 or 2% of the caffeine. What happens to that caffeine and the solvent? It's actually used in soda pop. It's used in Coca-Cola and Dr. Pepper and all the caffeinated sodas that are out there. Get their caffeine from coffee beans that have been stripped of it in the decaffeination process. I find that fascinating. All right, aside over. Chocolate has about 4 milligrams of caffeine, so comparatively to a decaf cup of coffee, it's about the same. Chocolate is a wonderful food that we enjoy, of course, today as a treat, but originally it was used by the Aztecs. Quetzalcoatl, the third god of the Aztecs, was said to have brought chocolate to them from paradise. It was the food of the gods. And that is, in fact, how it was named by the scientific naming convention of Linnaeus, Carolinus Linnaeus, who started to name things and put them in categories, and he called chocolate Theobroma, food of the gods, literally. So chocolate comes from a particular tree, the cacao tree, C-A-C-A-O. And the cacao tree originally grew in South America and on the hills of the Andes Mountains, the western hills of the Andes. I'm sorry, the eastern side of the Andes. And having that specific climate, it was restricted to South America, but after importation into Europe, which happens, again, roughly around the same time as we've been hearing about other drugs and foods and spices and so forth in the 1500s, and certainly by the 1600s, global trade of that kind has begun. And so chocolate makes its way to Europe, and it's found to grow actually very well just south of Europe in Africa. So there's a lot of chocolate plantations in the western part of Africa, northwestern part of Africa, in the countries of Ghana, Mali, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, and so forth. Those countries are where most of the chocolate comes from today in the world, and unfortunately they are mired in some controversy over their labor source. There's a video to click on in the notes regarding the use of slave labor and child slave labor particularly, which is problematic when it comes to the growing of chocolate and some of the sourcing of that chocolate by much wealthier European and American companies, which take advantage of that cheap labor, which again is unfortunately essentially child slave labor. All right, so chocolate comes off of the pods of these trees. Pod would be probably about the size of your forearm, roughly, with your fist closed, a foot or so tall, bigger or smaller, a little variability there. But when you split the pod open, you'll see this in the video if you watch that video, the notes. And if you split that pod open, you'll find the cacao kernel, and that's a kind of a gooey, bitter white kernel, which if you mash up, you can mix with water and make a beverage, and that's how the Aztecs would drink chocolate. It doesn't taste anything like hot chocolate or a chocolate drink today. All right, so chocolate is also blessed with a third xanthine chemical, and that's theobromine. Theobroma is the name of the plant, and theobromine, the name of the xanthine chemical that does give one a lift, but not too much. It's not like coffee or even tea. Other caffeine-related beverages have the caffeine essentially imported into the beverage, like sodas, as I mentioned, comes from the caffeine removed from coffee. Same thing with energy drinks. You can take pills that have caffeine in them. Vibrant, no-dose were popular in my day. No, these are not the same as Adderall or Ritalin, which are a different stimulant category than caffeine. They are more related to amphetamines. So, yeah, that's about it. I think that wraps it up for caffeine. I'll meet you back home. Talk about chapters 12 and 13 of High Price. See you there. All right, hi folks. I'm back here at home in front of the stove, but it's a little bit warm for a fire today, so I'm going to do this without the nice looking fire behind me. So now we're looking at High Price, chapters 12 and 13, and in these chapters, Hart is really delving into the sociology behind drugs, looking into, in chapter 12, the intersection of race and ethnicity with respect to drugs and drug laws through history. And in chapter 13, looking at the psychological concepts of stigma and reinforcement. So he begins chapter 12 with a description of an article that he finds when he's doing research in graduate school, an article from the New York Times in the 1920s, which looked strangely familiar to him, having lived in the 1980s in Miami. And he describes it as a very similar situation in the 1920s as was happening in the 1980s with respect to cocaine and how blacks are treated in relation to that drug. In the 1980s, of course, it's crack cocaine that is the drug du jour, the drug that is demonized and associated particularly with the so-called inner city, which he calls very clearly code for black in the 1980s, time of greater racial sensitivity, I guess you could call it, or maybe political correctness with respect to the language and how that's used, but very similar in other ways to the 1920s and the article that is described in the New York Times from then. He goes on to tell a personal story about how he is targeted as a suspect in a crime that has taken place near the NIH campus, but that's the National Institute of Health, where he's doing a postdoc, something you would do as a research opportunity after your doctorate degree has been earned, before you get your first job as a professor. So he's working there, and he's pointed out because of his race and because of his clothing as a potential burglar, and despite having lots of qualifications, an ID card, being an employee there, having an advanced degree didn't help. And so all of these factors are underwhelmed by the fact that he's black and that he was wearing a purple jumpsuit at the time. Not truly particularly good investigative skills being used by the officers there, relying primarily on really racial bias and profiling, despite the fact that those officers, as he points out, themselves are black. He says that minority officers often are the more egregious offenders of institutional discrimination because they often have more to prove in the law enforcement institutions that they belong to. In the last sentence of the chapter, he says,
All of this made me think a lot more critically about my research and about how to think about drugs. In Chapter 13, The Behavior of Human Subjects, he discusses the addiction stigma and how that is a real form of bias in American society, particularly today, but really most societies today feature this bias. He says the notion that addiction was some kind of character defect or extreme condition that created completely unpredictable and irrational actions began to seem misguided when he was doing research on people who were given reinforcements that were an alternative to the drug that they were addicted to. And he wanted to see how far he could push the level of reinforcement down in order to see how strong it was a competitor for the reinforcement of the addictive drug behavior. He describes this early in the book as well, in the first chapter, I believe, when he's giving $5 or $10 to drug users who are showing a lot of thought and a lot less anticipated immediate reaction to go straight for the drug. That's how we think of addicted users, is that they'll always choose the drug before any other kind of reinforcement, but that's not true, he says. And he starts rethinking the power of addiction and the addiction stigma when he starts doing his experiments. This is a kind of treatment called contingency management, and it offers alternative reinforcers for drug addicts. They're finding that this is a particularly useful method of rehabilitation, contingency management. He says, there's now a whole body of literature showing that providing alternative reinforcers improves addiction treatment outcomes. It is far more effective than using punitive measures like incarceration, which often is less useful in the long run. He particularly wants to point out that addicted use is not the same thing as regular controlled use of a drug. He says, I didn't distinguish between addictive use that interferes with major life functions like relationships and work, and controlled use that is pleasurable and not destructive. As he says at the beginning of the book, 75% or more of people who use drugs, even use drugs regularly, do not become addicted in the way that addicts behave with respect to losing jobs, breakup of families, and so forth. While that is certainly a potentiality, it is not the norm for drug use, and he finds that important to point out in this chapter. At the end of the chapter, he announces his pleasure at being offered an assistant professorship at Columbia University, and that is really the end of the first part of his journey through his education. He also describes the difficulty of getting there through the various postdocs at NIH and at Yale, and how the academic life is incredibly competitive. I think you'll find that to be true if you go on in school, into graduate school particularly. Perhaps most importantly, at the end, he talks about how truly we need to treat individuals as individuals when it comes to their issues and problems, look at their personal histories, look at their experiences, look at them as a person, as a human being standing in front of you, rather than as a stereotype of a drug user or an addict. He says this very eloquently at the end. I now try to minimize the extent to which theories or stereotypes influence my view of drug users, especially if they are standing before me and I can collect my own data. So I'd encourage you to do that. Collect your own data when you encounter people, not just about drug use, but about the person themselves. Get to know people, and then you can discover their issues, their problems on an individual basis, and see what motivates them in order to potentially live a better life if there are problems. Finally, at the end, he does a big reveal in the last paragraph of the chapter, noting that his life is about to turn around after getting that job at Columbia, when he learns that he fathered a child at age 16. This is 10 years later now, and he's just learned this information. Read the next chapter to find out what happens. Okay, assignments this week now. Assignments this week are pretty straightforward. We're just going to continue to do that chapter quiz, do the discussion online for Sunday, and the online media online. We'll have a bi-weekly journal due next week. See you then. Take care.